They told the story only in whispers, because to say it out loud was to invite it back. Imagine this. A child vanishes into the forest, his small footsteps swallowed by the undergrowth. And when he returns, 10 years later, he has not aged a single day. The same face, the same body, the same height. While the world grew older, while men died in wars and mothers buried their children, he remained frozen, like time itself had bent around him. His name was Jonathan Harker, and in 1839 he walked into the woods outside Concord, Massachusetts, never to be seen again, until a decade later, when he emerged from the tree line smiling as if no time had passed. You feel it already, don't you? That cold tightening in the chest. Because you know what this means. If a boy can step out of the world's clock, then everything we've been told about time, about death, about the natural order itself, is a lie. The record of Jonathan Harker is more than just a missing child case, buried in dusty archives. It's a keyhole into a forbidden truth, one that reveals how deeply the institutions ruling over us have hidden the mechanics of reality itself. I need you to understand. Children don't just pause. They don't freeze in time like a painting on a wall. Yet when Jonathan returned, physicians noted his skin unweathered, his teeth unchanged, his bones no older than the day he left. He still carried the toy wooden horse his father had carved for him, the wood smooth, unworn, untouched by the decade that had supposedly passed. His sister, now a grown woman, collapsed at the sight of him. His mother, aged and near death, screamed because she believed she was seeing an apparition, and here's the part they don't want you to know. This was not the only case. Other whispers exist. In New England, in the old Germanic forests, in villages where children disappear and reappear as if plucked from the grip of reality. But Jonathan's case was the one that frightened the early American elite most. Because he spoke. He remembered something. Not everything, but enough. Enough to leave journals scattered with cryptic notes, enough to make ministers preach sermons about demonic forces in the wilderness, and enough to make his name vanish from official records. And tonight, I will pull you through that same keyhole. You'll see what Jonathan saw. You'll feel what he carried back. And once you know it, you will never unknow it. When Jonathan reappeared, it was a summer evening in 1849. The sun had just begun to bleed into the horizon when a group of farmers spotted him walking calmly out of the tree line near Walden Pond. He looked no different than the morning he had vanished 10 years earlier. Barefoot, shirt torn at the shoulder, eyes wide but unafraid, a child frozen in time. At first, they thought it was a cruel trick, some village boy dressed to resemble the missing child. But when they carried him into town, the Harker family knew immediately. His father had withered into a gray-bearded old man. Yet when he gripped Jonathan's arms, he found the same boy he had tucked into bed the night before his disappearance. His sister, now a mother herself, fainted. His mother clawed at her face, crying that, "God has returned my son to torment me." Physicians were summoned. Doctors, ministers, even Harvard men who had studied the new sciences of anatomy and natural philosophy all examined him. Their conclusion: impossible. His teeth bore none of the wear of adolescence. His voice carried the same high pitch of a boy of 9. His hair had not grown past the length it was last cut. He was unchanged, preserved, as though sealed outside the reach of time, and yet he was not entirely the same. Witnesses described his manner as unnerving. He was polite, almost too polite, speaking in a calm, deliberate tone. When questioned about where he had been, he gave answers that chilled those who listened. "I was in the place where the trees hum," he said. "The shadows moved like people, but they had no faces, and they taught me things." What things? When pressed, he would only smile, tilt his head slightly and whisper things you should not want to know. The church declared it a miracle or a curse. The physicians insisted it was either fraud or madness. But deep in their journals, which were later confiscated, some of them admitted the truth. Jonathan carried knowledge far beyond his years. He spoke of herbs no one had catalogued, of stars invisible to the naked eye, of words in languages he should never have known. Men argued over whether he had been taken by God, by the devil, or by forces older than both. But what terrified them most was not his words. It was his eyes. One doctor wrote, "They were the eyes of an old man trapped in a child's skull, a gaze that seemed to strip the world bare." Jonathan Harker had not simply survived, he had returned with something not meant for a child, something not meant for any of us. The first sign that Jonathan Harker had not returned as merely a boy, but as a vessel, came the following winter. Animals began to avoid him. Horses bucked when he passed their stables. Dogs barked wildly, snapping their teeth through iron cages. Cats arched their backs and hissed, vanishing into the rafters. And yet Jonathan would stand there, unflinching, his pale lips curved in something between a smile and a study. Neighbors began whispering that he had brought something back with him, a darkness that clung to his skin. Some said they saw the trees bend when he walked by. Others swore they heard faint chanting when he was alone, as if he spoke to voices hidden in the branches. His father, desperate to reintegrate the boy into normal life, forced him to church, but the congregation recoiled. One eyewitness later confessed that the boy never blinked during the sermons, just sat, perfectly still, staring straight through the minister as though watching something behind him. Then came the incident with Reverend Alden. The minister, determined to prove that the child was merely disturbed and not supernatural, brought Jonathan before the pulpit. He asked him to recite the Lord's Prayer. Jonathan obeyed, but halfway through he stopped, tilted his head, and spoke words no one recognized. The congregation fell silent. The sound was not English, not Latin, not Greek, but something guttural and rhythmic, pulsing with an uncanny cadence. The Reverend shouted for him to stop, but Jonathan continued until women screamed and men dragged him out by force. Later, Alden admitted in private that what Jonathan spoke were not meaningless sounds. They were structured, measured, like an invocation. And in that moment he swore, the air in the church turned colder, as if every candle's flame strained against an invisible wind. The local authorities tried to intervene. Doctors were called again. They tested him, asking him to draw, to read, to write. What they discovered unsettled them more than anything. Jonathan's handwriting was flawless. His sketches were detailed anatomical diagrams of organs and bones, drawn with precision no boy should possess. One physician accused the family of tutoring him in secret, but the Harkers swore the boy had received no education beyond basic reading before his disappearance. Where, then, had he learned? Jonathan himself gave only one answer, spoken in that calm, unshakable voice. The forest teaches, but the forest does not forget. From that day forward, Concord whispered of him as the child outside of time. Not merely a boy returned, but a messenger. And every man who looked into his eyes wondered the same thing, if time could not touch him. What had? The first death was dismissed as an accident. That is how it always begins. A miller's apprentice, 17, strong as an ox, drowned in shallow water less than knee-deep. His body was found twisted at the edge of the pond where Jonathan had been seen sitting only hours before, tossing pebbles into the ripples. Witnesses claimed the boy was calm, serene, watching the water with a stillness that felt unnatural. When asked if he had seen the accident, Jonathan's answer was chilling. He did not fall. The water wanted him. People laughed nervously, but the laughter never reached their eyes. Because the second death followed swiftly, a farmer crushed beneath his own cart, though no one could explain why the sturdy axle had snapped. Jonathan had been there too, standing at the fence line, staring with that same hollow intensity. When confronted, he only whispered, "It's hungry." By the third death, there were no more jokes. A young girl was found pale and lifeless, her body free of wounds, as though the very spark of her had been stolen away. And who had discovered her? Jonathan. Again. His hands folded, his head bowed, as if he had been waiting for them to come find what he already knew. The townspeople began to murmur of curses, of demons wearing children's skin. Mothers clutched their infants tighter when he passed. Men began carrying charms and psalms, muttered under their breath like a shield, but it was not enough. The aura around him was thickening. Even nature seemed to turn. Crows gathered in the trees above the Harker home, silent, watching. Livestock refused to graze near the boy. Fires would dim when he entered a room. Dr. Whitfield, one of the physicians brought from Boston, left behind a journal. In it he wrote, "This boy is not of medical interest. He is of metaphysical terror. His presence corrodes reason itself. He does not act maliciously, yet misfortune radiates from him as naturally as heat from the sun. We stand not before a child, but a fracture in the order of the world." Jonathan himself never defended, never denied. When the town accused, he only said, "You fear me because I remind you. Time is not yours. Life is not yours. You are being kept." Those words spread like wildfire. And for the first time, the men of Concord began to suspect the unthinkable, that Jonathan Harker was not the victim of some strange abduction, but the messenger of a truth their world was not built to withstand. When whispers become too loud, power responds. The church was first. Reverend Alden declared Jonathan a danger to the community, a vessel of the adversary, cloaked in innocence. He argued that the boy's very existence was a mockery of divine order, proof that forces older than God were still at work in the forests of New England. The sermons became sharper, his voice trembling not with faith, but with fear. Parishioners recalled how the Reverend once pointed at Jonathan from the pulpit, declaring, "That child is not touched by grace, but by something that precedes creation." Then the state followed. Massachusetts authorities arrived under the guise of medical inquiry. 3 men from Boston, one a doctor, one a magistrate, and one who never gave his title, traveled to Concord and took Jonathan into their custody. Officially, it was to study him. Unofficially, it was to bury the truth. Witnesses saw the boy led away in chains that seemed absurd on such thin wrists. He did not struggle. He did not cry. He simply walked with them, barefoot in the dirt road, his eyes fixed straight ahead. One man recalled how the birds went silent as he passed, the forest itself holding its breath. What happened next never reached the newspapers, but fragments of reports, diaries, and sealed letters remain. The doctors at Harvard wrote of a child whose blood carried strange properties, clotting too quickly, resisting decay, as though life itself clung unnaturally to him. The magistrate noted that Jonathan could recite ancient texts he had never been taught. And the unnamed man, the D, one who carried no title, left behind no words, only a symbol, carved into the margins of his notes, a circle split by a vertical line. The mark of those who keep secrets, generation after generation. When Jonathan's father demanded his son's return, he was told the boy had wandered away during the night. But some locals swear the truth was darker. They claim a carriage left Boston under cover of moonlight, its windows shuttered, its passenger silent. That was the last time Jonathan Harker was seen in public record, yet whispers persisted. A decade later, in the corridors of certain universities, men spoke of a child who defied the clock. Ministers warned their congregations not to seek the wilderness for answers. And those who had seen Jonathan up close never slept without dreams of endless forests, where time stood still and shadows whispered in languages older than Scripture. This was not the end of Jonathan Harker. No. This was the beginning of his erasure. Because when institutions cannot explain, they suppress. And what they suppress often reveals far more than what they teach. When Jonathan vanished into the hands of authority, Concord should have breathed a sigh of relief. But instead, the silence that followed was heavier, more oppressive, as though the town itself knew it had merely traded one terror for another. The boy was gone, but the questions he left behind could not be buried. Men whispered in taverns, of secret societies, groups older than the Republic itself, who collected anomalies like Jonathan, hiding them from the world while studying what truths their existence betrayed. It was said the Freemasons in Boston took interest, that the Puritan bloodlines, who once hanged witches, still guarded knowledge of children out of time. Farmers claimed to see cloaked men in the woods at night, circling the trees where Jonathan first disappeared, carrying lanterns that flickered with strange blue fire. And always, the forest loomed. The Puritans had long warned that the New England wilderness was no mere expanse of trees, but a realm untamed by God, where older laws still held sway. Ministers taught that Satan lurked in the thickets. Natives, before they were silenced, spoke of places where the boundary between worlds grew thin. Jonathan had stepped into those shadows, and when he returned, he had carried them with him. But here lies the deeper terror. The institutions did not seek to destroy Jonathan. They sought to understand him. Not for protection of the people, but for power. Imagine what it would mean if aging could be defied. Imagine an elite bloodline, eternal, untouched by time, ruling over men who crumbled like dust around them. To control the secret of Jonathan Harker was to control the very clockwork of reality. The psychology of the town began to shift. Men feared their own children. Women whispered of changelings, offspring swapped by inhuman hands. And at night, a sickness spread. Dreams of endless corridors of trees, of chanting in that same guttural tongue Jonathan had spoken in church. Some woke with soil under their nails, as though they had wandered into the forest in their sleep. Others swore they saw him, Jonathan, standing at the edge of their fields, unchanged, unblinking, watching. The message was clear, though few dared speak it aloud. Jonathan had never been just a boy. He was evidence. Evidence that time itself is not a straight line, but a leash. And somewhere someone or something was holding the other end. Years after Jonathan's disappearance into the custody of Boston's men, scraps of his writings began to surface, small notebooks, fragments of parchment, even words carved into wooden toys he had once carried. They appeared in odd places, tucked into the floorboards of his family home, discovered in the rafters of the church, even hidden behind loose stones near the edge of the forest. Some called them hoaxes. But those who read them knew instantly they were not the hand of a child. The writings contained diagrams of trees not native to New England, maps of forests that stretched into infinity, with paths that twisted back upon themselves like serpents devouring their tails. And alongside these drawings were cryptic symbols, circles intersected by vertical lines, spirals splitting into jagged angles, and eyes enclosed within roots. Always the same shapes, repeated with obsessive precision. What unsettled scholars most was the language. Scrawled between English words were passages in tongues no one could identify. Not Latin, not Greek, not Hebrew, but something older, as though predating every alphabet men had ever carved into stone. Linguists described it as structured madness, a grammar too precise to be nonsense. When translated phonetically, the words pulsed like incantations, vibrating in the throat in ways that left the reader trembling. One phrase appeared again and again: "The forest does not forget." Those who studied the journals for too long suffered. One Harvard student who examined the symbols was later found wandering barefoot into the same woods where Jonathan vanished, muttering that he could hear the humming. Another man, a minister who had tried to burn the writings, died in his sleep, his body rigid, his eyes wide open as though frozen in terror at the moment of death. The fragments also hinted at something greater. Jonathan wrote of the Watchers in the Hollow, beings without faces who taught him the names of stars unseen by mortal eyes. He claimed they showed him how time was not a river, but a cage of mirrors, reflecting, looping, breaking. He spoke of humans as livestock, their lives carefully measured, harvested, and forgotten. And in the margins of one particularly weathered notebook, a chilling confession: "I was chosen because I was small enough to fit through the cracks. They will choose again." The implication was undeniable. Jonathan Harker was not unique. He was one of many, a test perhaps, a herald. And if the writings were true, then somewhere in those endless woods, others were waiting. Others who had already stepped outside the leash of time. The writings should have changed everything, but instead, they were buried. Those who touched Jonathan's journals found themselves marked, not by superstition, but by the cold precision of institutional suppression. The first was Elias Pritchard, a schoolteacher who dared present Jonathan's diagrams at a town meeting. Within a week, his home burned to the ground, his body discovered in the ash. The official report claimed faulty lantern oil, but those who examined his remains noted something strange. His eyes had not been burned, only blackened, as though ink had flooded them from within. Next came Dr. Whitfield, the Boston physician who had confessed in his notes that Jonathan represented a fracture in the order of the world. Whitfield's body was found floating in the Charles River, his pockets stuffed with stones, his journal missing. His colleagues declared it suicide. Yet witnesses swore they had seen men in dark coats following him for weeks prior. By the mid-1850s, the journals themselves began to vanish. Families who claimed to have found Jonathan's fragments awoke to find their homes ransacked, doors unbroken, valuables untouched, but the writings gone. And in their place, often a single mark scratched into wood or stone, that same circle, split by a vertical line. A reminder, a warning, you must see the pattern. This was no random fear, no local hysteria. This was methodical removal, the hand of power. Institutions moving like clockwork to erase what could not be explained. But why? Because Jonathan's story exposed the fragility of control. If time itself could be pierced, if a child could step outside the system and return carrying forbidden knowledge, then what authority could stand? What sermon would hold? What government decree would matter? So they silenced it. They scrubbed his name from parish records. They sealed court transcripts. They erased the boy not because he was dangerous in himself, but because the truth he carried was a truth that the forest whispered to him, that human life is managed, harvested, and monitored, that time is not freedom, but containment, that men in robes, in pulpits, in offices do not govern reality, they only guard the bars of the cage. But here is the part they could never erase. Jonathan himself had said it. They will choose again. If the forest could take one child, it could take another. And if the Watchers gave knowledge once, they would give it again. That possibility, the idea that someone else might slip through the cracks, terrified the ruling order more than Jonathan himself ever did. Jonathan's Story was never just about a boy. It was about control, how power keeps its grip on men by shaping not only what they see, but what they fear. The disappearance, the journals, the suppression, these were not isolated events. They were mechanisms, proof of how an invisible order maintains obedience. Think of the forest. To the Puritans it was wilderness, a place of devils and shadows. To the natives it was sacred, alive, a realm of spirits and cycles beyond human law. To Jonathan, it became a threshold, an opening in the very fabric of time. But notice what the institutions did. They never taught the people that the forest might hold knowledge. They taught them to fear it. They weaponized the unknown. They turned mystery into terror. Because a man who fears the dark does not enter it, and a man who does not enter the dark never learns its secrets. This is how power works. Control is not sustained by force alone. It is sustained by narrative, by telling men what is holy and what is cursed, by convincing them that survival depends on obedience. The Salem witch trials, the sermons of Cotton Mather, the endless warnings about Satan lurking in the trees, all were instruments of psychological conditioning. Jonathan's existence threatened that conditioning. He proved there was more beyond the fence, more beyond the sermon, more beyond the pulpit. And that kind of proof had to be buried, but the mind of Concord was already breaking. Reports surfaced of men who wandered at night into the forest, hearing whispers that were not their own thoughts. Women began dreaming of endless clocks, their hands moving backward. Children sketched the same symbols Jonathan once drew, though they had never seen his journals. The control system was fraying. Fear was no longer enough. Here lies the deepest horror. Control is never about protecting you, it is about limiting you. The authorities didn't care if the forest contained danger. They cared that it contained freedom. They cared that Jonathan had glimpsed a truth that could not be contained by scripture, law, or empire. And so they tightened their grip. They erased the boy. They erased his writings. They taught men to mock the story, to call it a myth, to laugh at it in taverns. Because ridicule is just another weapon of control, silence through shame. Yet the symbols returned, etched into trees at the edge of farms, carved into school desks, drawn into the dirt by small, unseen hands. Control may erase names, but it cannot erase memory, and memory once awakened spreads like fire. What then were the watchers in the hollow? The ministers called them demons. The physicians dismissed them as hallucinations. The philosophers muttered about archetypes and madness. But none of those labels fit, because Jonathan described them, not with the frenzied language of a child's nightmare, but with the precision of someone recounting a lesson. He wrote, "They have no faces, because faces are for men who need to be recognized. They do not walk, because walking is for men who live in time. They drift like smoke, but heavier, and when they stand near you, the clocks go silent." Imagine that. A presence that cancels the ticking of the world. A force so absolute that even time itself bows into silence. The watchers were not spirits of the forest. They were the forest. The intelligence behind its cycles. The reason the trees rot, then bloom again. The reason generations are born, live, and die in rhythm. Jonathan said they fed not on flesh, but on sequence. They devoured moments, harvesting human years as easily as a farmer harvests grain. That is why they chose him. Because children are not yet bound fully to the chain of hours. Their sense of time is pliable, elastic. To a child, a summer can last forever, and yet a single night can feel like an eternity. Jonathan was a doorway, a weak point in the wall, small enough to slip through the cracks that adults no longer notice. But there is something even darker. His writings suggest the watchers were not unique to Concord, or to New England, or even to the forests of the earth. He drew diagrams of constellations that had not been charted by astronomers, and beneath them inscriptions, "They are in the hollow of the sky." He claimed the stars themselves were watchers, vast, patient, feeding not on minutes or hours but on epochs, and the forests, the rivers, the caves were simply mirrors of their cosmic hunger. So when men in black coats and ministers in pulpits called Jonathan mad, understand what they were protecting. If his words were true, then the entire world is an enclosure, a field of harvested cycles, and the watchers, those faceless keepers, are not intruders. They are the owners. Perhaps that is why his journals vanished. Not because they were dangerous lies, but because they were dangerous truths. To admit the existence of the watchers would mean admitting that every prayer, every law, every empire, every sermon is nothing more than a distraction, a ritual performed by livestock to comfort themselves in the cage. Jonathan saw it, and once he saw it, he could never unsee it. After Jonathan vanished from the records, the town of Concord tried to forget him. But forgetting is never clean. The symbols followed. That crude circle split by a vertical line, scrawled in charcoal, and blood began appearing where fear and grief pooled deepest. The first confirmed reappearance came in 1862 during the Civil War. Soldiers bivouacked near Antietam discovered the mark carved into trees around their camp. Some claimed it appeared overnight. Days later, those same soldiers were slaughtered in the bloodiest single day in American history. Survivors reported a silence before the cannon fire, a silence so absolute that men swore the world had stopped breathing. Jonathan's words echoed, "When they stand near you, the clocks go silent." By the 1870s, asylum attendants in New York began reporting children drawing the mark into the dust with their fingernails. These children, like Jonathan, spoke of the hollow, of being watched by shapes that cancelled the sound of ticking clocks. Doctors dismissed it as hysteria, but when they tried to scrub the marks from the walls, the carvings reappeared the next morning, etched deeper as though no hand had made them at all. Then came the orphanages. In 1881, a matron at the Ashford orphanage awoke to find every child's bedsheet slashed with the same circle and line. She thought it a prank, but within a week, scarlet fever swept the institution, taking 30 children in 3 nights. Survivors whispered that just before the fevers peaked, the halls fell into a silence so heavy it crushed the air. It was not just children. The symbols turned up on battlefields, prison walls, even scratched into the pews of abandoned churches. Always the same shape, always in places where human time was cut short, where suffering thickened like smoke. The watchers, it seemed, were not bound to Concord. They were drawn to cycles of death and despair, the way vultures are drawn to carrion. This spread was not random. It was systemic, precise, a pattern across the map of America, following the arteries of human conflict. Wherever the old order crumbled, war, disease, institutional collapse, the mark would surface. A reminder, a signal, perhaps even a signature of ownership. Think of the terror this implies. The watchers do not create tragedy. They do not need to. They simply arrive when tragedy ripens, when the harvest is ready. And in that silence, they feed. Jonathan was only the first witness, but he was not the last. The mark should have been a warning, a curse etched into history, too dangerous to touch. But men are never content to fear what they cannot control. They must attempt to wield it. That is how Jonathan's symbols, once scribbled in terror by a boy, became the property of secret orders. By the late 19th century, whispers spread of fraternal lodges and clandestine brotherhoods using the circle and line in their rites. They claimed it was not a mark of doom, but of mastery. These men believed that the watchers were not predators, but teachers, keepers of a knowledge older than Scripture, older than civilization itself. Where the church saw demons and madness, these societies saw opportunity. Documents unearthed from a defunct Masonic lodge in Boston revealed minutes of a meeting in 1894. The brothers described the Watchers as custodians of the Great Cycle. They inscribed the mark on their initiation chambers, believing it tethered them to the very forces that devoured human time. They called it alignment, standing in rhythm with the harvesters. Even darker were the reports from Europe. In Berlin, an occult order known as Die Kreiswächter, the Circle Watchers, adopted Jonathan's symbol as their seal. Survivors of their rituals claimed the initiates sat in pitch-black chambers, waiting until the sound of clocks ceased. Only then would the rite begin. Only then would the masters speak of communion with those faceless forms. But perhaps the most unsettling use of the mark surfaced in America's religious fringes. A sect in Pennsylvania twisted the symbol into a cross, claiming it was the true sign of Christ's return, not as a savior, but as a judge of cycles. Their sermons declared, "Time is not yours, it is leased, and soon the owner will collect." Understand what this means. The Watchers had no priests, no temples, no scriptures, yet men rushed to build them on their behalf. Why? Because power loves power. If the Watchers truly fed on cycles, then to align oneself with their rhythm was to share in their dominion. It was not worship, it was negotiation. This was the most perverse betrayal of Jonathan's truth. He had seen the Watchers as horror, as the theft of freedom itself. But the secret orders saw only advantage. They were willing to kneel, not in fear, but in hunger. They wanted a share of the harvest, and so the mark spread not only in silence and tragedy, but in ritual, in ceremony, in ambition. Jonathan's warning had been inverted, his fear had become their weapon. We must now confront the most disturbing question. Were the Watchers ever truly seen? Not glimpsed in the terror of children or scrawled in fevered journals, but encountered directly, deliberately, by those who sought them out. The answer, whispered in the archives of forgotten societies and sealed testimonies, is yes, and those accounts are too consistent across time and continents to ignore. In 1901, a lodge in Boston recorded the experience of an initiate during a midnight ritual. Blindfolded, he was led into a chamber where the mark was carved into the stone floor. The blindfold was removed, and for a span of 13 minutes all sound in the city block ceased. No bells tolled, no rats scratched in the walls, no footsteps echoed from the streets. The initiate swore that in the silence, a presence stood inches from him, faceless, immense, pressing against his skin without touch. He collapsed, screaming. When revived, his hair had turned white. In 1927, across the ocean, a German mystic claimed to have summoned the Watchers in a Berlin basement. His journal describes them with terrifying precision. They are not seen with the eyes, but with the failure of sight. Their faces are absence. Their limbs are arrangement, like broken scaffolds of smoke. When they incline toward you, thought itself ceases. It is not terror, it is vacancy. They are not anger, they are function. He died 3 months later, his body unnaturally preserved, as though time had paused inside his flesh. And then there is the testimony from 1936 in the Appalachian Mountains of America. A small Pentecostal sect performed a midnight revival in a collapsing church. Witnesses claimed the preacher had inscribed the forbidden mark on the altar, declaring it the seal of God's return. The congregation fell into trance, swaying in silence when suddenly every oil lamp guttered out. For 17 minutes no one moved. When the lamps flared again, 3 members of the congregation were gone. vanished without trace, as though they had never stood among the pews. Their names were never written again in census rolls. It was as if they had been erased from the cycle. These are not isolated tales. They appear in Russia, in France, in rural Asia, scattered like fragments of the same dark hymn. Always the same markers, the silence, the faceless nearness, the sense of time breaking apart like glass. Too many parallels, too precise to dismiss as hysteria. The watchers do not come when called by prayer or by sacrifice. They come when the walls of time thin, when men tamper with the rhythm of cycles. And when they arrive, they do not speak, they do not reason, they do not bless. They harvest. Jonathan had seen them by accident. These men sought them deliberately, and in their hunger for control, they opened doors that should never have been touched. If the secret societies of the 19th century sought the watchers in candle-lit chambers, the 20th century brought a darker ambition. War. For what is war, if not the greatest rupture of human time? Entire generations consumed, millions silenced in an instant. To generals and governments, this was no longer myth, it was opportunity. The earliest hints appear in the First World War. Reports from the trenches at Ypres spoke of sudden silences before artillery bombardments. Soldiers claimed the birds stopped, the wind stilled, the very mud quieted. Then, amid the carnage, some men swore they saw shapes, faceless silhouettes drifting between the wounded, untouched by fire or bullet. These accounts were buried in military logs, dismissed as shell shock. But curiously, those units that reported the silent ones suffered casualties at nearly double the rate of neighboring regiments. Coincidence? Or harvest? By the Second World War, interest in the watchers had moved from superstition into science. In Germany, documents recovered after the fall of Berlin revealed that the SS conducted experiments with what they called Zeitstillstände, time standstills. Prisoners were locked in sealed chambers marked with Jonathan's symbol, while clocks were synchronized outside. Witnesses reported that, inside, time fractured. Hours vanished in minutes. Some prisoners emerged, aged decades overnight. Others dissolved into silence, their cells empty, their names scratched from records. The experiments ended only with the Reich's collapse, but the files did not vanish. They were absorbed by the victors. America, too, was not innocent. Buried among declassified projects lies a cryptic entry, Operation Duskfield, 1949. Though most of the file remains blacked out, fragments speak of attempts to reproduce battlefield silences using electromagnetic fields. Witnesses describe the sudden cessation of all sound in a radius of 200 feet and temporary displacement phenomena. The experiments were officially abandoned. Yet decades later, military contractors continued probing silence. Synchronization and symbols, the very language Jonathan left behind. Even in the Cold War, whispers spread of Soviet scientists working on Project Chazy, the clocks. Defectors spoke of underground labs where children were trained to draw the forbidden mark from memory. Why? Because wherever the mark appeared, silence followed. And silence, the Soviets believed, was a weapon capable of unraveling both machines and minds. But here lies the greatest horror. In seeking to weaponize the watchers, these governments were not merely exploiting myth, they were inviting it. Every experiment, every ritual dressed up as research was a doorway pried wider. The watchers were not bound to folklore anymore. They had been ushered into the engines of empire, and once war made them a tool, there could be no turning back. Jonathan's nightmare had become statecraft. You may think the watchers belong to the age of war and secret lodges, but you are wrong. They are here, woven into the architecture of your daily life, hidden in the rhythms of your machines. The harvest no longer requires dark chambers or battlefield silences. It only requires you to participate. Look around you. Every device in your pocket is ruled by clocks. Every screen flickers in cycles, syncing your mind to rhythms you cannot perceive. Corporations learned long ago what the orders and governments discovered in ritual: control time, and you control man. But beneath the convenience, beneath the technology, something older lurks. In the 1970s, as digital timepieces spread across the world, engineers noticed anomalies in certain prototypes. Testers reported silent gaps, brief moments when all sound vanished in the lab. Some even described seeing figures in their peripheral vision, vanishing when they turned. The patents for those devices vanished into corporate vaults, never reaching the public. But the research didn't stop. It simply moved underground. The rise of synchronized global networks, the Internet of Time, was the final invitation. Billions of devices now pulse in harmony, beating in cycles so precise that they create fields of silence, invisible but measurable. Physicists call them temporal anomalies. To others, they are doorways. And every day, as you glance at your phone, as you refresh your feeds, as you submit your life to the rhythm of the clock, the harvest grows richer. Whispers from Silicon Valley engineers tell of late-night test runs in server farms where entire wings go silent. No humming, fans, no buzzing lights, no footsteps echoing in vast halls. Workers speak of shadows at the end of aisles, faceless figures watching but never moving, waiting for alignment. One man claimed his badge photo, taken before a blackout, showed him aged by 20 years. His colleagues laughed. He vanished from the company months later, his file erased. Corporations have no interest in warning you. To them, silence is efficiency. Anomalies are data. What Jonathan feared as monsters, they see as systems. You are no longer prey running from unseen hunters. You are livestock penned by machines, offering your cycles freely. Understand this. The Watchers no longer need to break into your world. You have built them a throne of circuits and screens, and every passing second, every pulse of your device is an offering. The harvest has become invisible, ordinary, constant. The Watchers no longer wait in shadows. They wait in time itself.